module of this course will cover plagiarism and citations, which is a more complex topic than you might actually think. And there's a reason we put it first. It's because for most academic and professional institutions alike, plagiarism is considered very serious and will result in you being eliminated from the organization where you're studying or working, or from your paper being withdrawn from publication, for example. So most of you might think of plagiarism as the most pure definition that exists, which is representing someone else's work as your own. You might picture someone Googling a certain essay that you need to turn in and then literally copying and pasting it into your Word browser and putting your name on it, claiming that it's yours, or, for example, commissioning a friend to write a paper for you. These are all definitely forms of plagiarism and are the most serious forms. But there's two other ways that you can actually plagiarize technically, both of which are to be avoided as well. So the second, which we'll focus on a lot today, is patch writing. Most of you probably have not heard this term, but what it means is essentially patching together the phrasing of another writer or of a source without using quotation marks. And this might happen intentionally or unintentionally. However, your intent doesn't matter. So even if you accidentally mimic the phrasing of someone else and do not cite it or put it in quotation marks, this is considered a form of plagiarism. So when this happens, usually you have just read a source, for example, and are attempting to summarize it in your own words and find that those words are sort of fresh in your head, the author's words, and you unintentionally perhaps mimic the verbiage or the content of that source word for word. This might only be a 3-word phrase, but if you are copying a 3-word phrase that is used in your source, it should be in quotation marks, even if you are attributing it. If it's not your phrasing, it needs quotes. Intentionally, this might happen when you copy and paste a passage from a source into your Word document, your thesis, for example, or whatever else is due, any other assignment, and you try to rearrange it in an attempt to make a summary. So I understand this practice. It's strategic. It works for some people. However, it often results in unintentionally using the exact phrasing of the author without quote marks. So we're going to practice today avoiding this form of plagiarism. And the third form of plagiarism is citation neglect. So you're not using the exact words of another author or another source without quotation marks, but you are using ideas or information from other sources without attributing it. And having an entry in your bibliography is not enough. We need to be practicing in-text citations very, very religiously when it comes to academic writing, especially, or writing in journals, for example. Not all disciplines obviously require this. You read news articles and you don't see in-text citations there, but oftentimes you'll see the practice of hyperlinking phrases to attribute the appropriate source. So this is also serious. We need to be attributing with in-text citations every idea, opinion, statistic, fact, finding that comes from another source with the appropriate in-text citation. And this does include quotes as well. If you're including a quote, it needs to be cited so that the reader knows where it comes from and can find the original creator of that work. So these are the 3 forms, and we're going to talk about how to avoid all of them today so that you don't intentionally or unintentionally commit plagiarism while in this program or in your future academic or professional career. So to avoid the first form of plagiarism, the one that you probably are most familiar with, it's very simple. Just don't do it. You know when you're stealing someone else's work. You know when you're Googling for an essay and then copying it into your own document and representing it as your own. So just don't do it. It's never worth it. It's better to turn in a bad version of a paper or an essay or not turn it in at all than to plagiarize, because a bad essay or failure to turn in an assignment or turning in a paragraph when it should be 5 pages, for example, those will all result in bad grades. However, your professor might work with you, let you turn it again, help you through the process of getting that assignment finished. But if you plagiarize and are caught, which you often are because it's very easy to catch plagiarism, then you will often be expelled from your institution. And this will go on your record. Future potential employers, for example, or schools that are interviewing you for a master's program or a PhD program will ask you, what happened? Why did you leave early? And you'll have to tell them. So this will go on your record forever. It's kind of like going to jail for an academic, so it's never worth it. Do not do it here. Do not do it ever. that's the end of that story. Patch writing obviously is a little more complex. So the definition of patch writing is copying from a source text and then deleting some words, altering grammatical structures, or plugging in one-for-one synonym substitutes. But like I said, this is one version. That's when you're like, okay, it's going to be a lot easier to just sort of copy and manipulate this passage into a summary than to try to put it in my own words. The other version is when you do this accidentally. So it's the phrasing gets stuck in your head, you accidentally spit it back out, and now you have patch wrote in unintentionally even. It's still a problem. So ways to avoid patch writing. First of all, try to read to understand. So instead of just reading to glean material for your paper, for your literature review, for example, is probably the most common place this will happen. Read to really get a grasp of what the author or authors are saying. And take really good notes when you're writing, and don't just write down, replicate what's actually in the passage. Try to rephrase a sentence or a paragraph in your own words. Write down just, for example, the percent or the statistic or the number instead of writing down the sentence itself. Another is just to stop that practice of copying, literally, Control-C on your browser, Control-V, pasting into your own document. I know it makes it a lot easier, but just don't do it, because inevitably you will end up eventually copying the phrasing of someone else without citing it properly or quoting it properly. Of course, if you're using a block quote or a really long quote, you can copy and paste this from the source. That's fine, as long as you are putting it in quotation marks to indicate that it is not your own words and then citing it. Another tip, in addition to reading sources to understand, is to wait at least an hour after reading a source to start writing about it. So this lets you digest the information, sort of think about it critically, and then when you go back to summarize it, you're more able to use your own words rather than just spitting out what you just heard. And then finally, try to write a source initially, at least, without looking at it. So close out the window in your browser, shut the book if you have a physical book. I know not many of us do anymore, but try to do that. And just write about it from your memory. Write what you think was important from that source for your work. Then, of course, you can go back and reference it, make sure you got it right. But that's a really good way to kind of make sure you're not accidentally just spitting back out what you read. So I want to give you all an opportunity to practice. Here is a passage from a paper. I believe it's from the abstract, so it's sort of summarial in nature. But I want you to pause this video, and then what you're going to do is take out a piece of paper. Yes, you're actually going to write with a pen. Read the passage over at least twice. You might want to read it 3 times. Read to understand. If you have the time, walk away from your computer for a minute. Go for a short walk, do a little chore that you need to do. Then return and try to write a short summary of it. This is going to be 2 to 3 sentences, not using any of the original phrasing from here, so no quotes. Just try to write a summary of what it's saying in your own words. And if you want, we can go over this over email or in person to see how you did. You'll also have an assignment like this week that's very similar, asking you to read something and then summarize it without looking. So pause, and then when you resume, you'll pick up where we left off. So moving on, that's it for patch writing, aside from the assignments you'll have this week. But I want to talk about how to avoid attribution neglect, so not citing your sources properly. So a lot of students often ask me, how often do I need to really cite? If you're, for example, discussing one source for the course of a whole page in your literature review, do you need to keep citing it over and over again? There's no hard and fast rules about this, but in general, anytime you have a specific idea or a specific finding, like especially something numerical or something in the nature of discovering something, or anytime you have a quote, there should be a citation in that same sentence. If you're sort of summarizing a longer paper and you're not stating specific findings or ideas, you can add the citation at the end. But you always need it at the end, because if you just have a citation, for example, for the first sentence that discusses a source and then continue discussing it, but maybe aren't referencing the source itself, you're just referencing the information there, the reader might not know that that came from that original source. They might think that you've moved on to talk about other sources or are synthesizing additional sources. So really work on citing every specific idea, fact, finding, etc. And another thing, a lot of you might be using things like Mendeley, which are great organizational tools, or online citation generators such as Citation Machine and EasyBib. That's okay with me, but you need to check every citation at least twice manually during your revision process. So you know, it's fine to copy and paste from Citation Machine or EasyBib, or to just use the insert with the Mendeley app for Microsoft Word, but you should be checking these and making sure they were rendered correctly. And then finally, OWL English Purdue. That's OWL stands for Online Writing Lab, but that's why we have a photo of an owl here. It comes from Purdue University. This is a great resource for citations. They have a lot of other great material about writing and language up there as well, but I really like how they organize information for citations, so I'll do a quick tutorial for you guys on that as well this week, but make sure you check it out and look at the APA section. So those are your resources. This is sort of the basics of the citation landscape. So, you know, the top three are APA, American Psychological Association. That's what most of you are using, or some slight variation of it. But for this class, you need to follow APA exactly. And you can sort of remember it as the citation style that cares about years. So in every in-text citation, you need the year published included. And it's often used in the social sciences, psychology, for example, sociology, and hard sciences as well. Then we have MLA, which is Modern Language Association. This is sort of known as the page number citation, because for every idea cited, every in-text citation needs a page number, unless, of course, it's online and doesn't have pages. And it's more commonly used in the humanities, so English literature, for example. And the third common citation style is Chicago. Also always includes page numbers, and the distinctive feature about Chicago is that instead of using in-text parenthetical citations, it uses footnotes and endnotes at the bottom or end of a paper, often used in the sciences and the medical field as well. There are other citations, but these are the big three, and you should be at least familiar with them, because while you might not be required to use Chicago now, for example, or MLA now, you might eventually submit to a journal that requires you to convert all of your citations to Chicago, which is a huge pain, but you have to do it if you want to get published. So you should know what it means and maybe be a little familiar at least, so your learning curve is less if that opportunity ever presents. And a couple shorthand for citations that you will come across often in both writing and reading literature are et al., which is short for et alia and literally means and others in Latin, and is used to denote additional authors. So when you're citing in text and you have a paper with maybe at least 3 and maybe up to like 20 authors, some of these papers have a ton of authors, you can use et al. Instead of listing all of their last names and taking up a ton of room in your paper. So this is not for the bibliography, this is for citations only, but it's to denote, you know, this is the first author listed, and there's a bunch of other people that wrote it too, and you can look into the bibliography if you are a reader who is interested. Another you'll often see is ibid. This is used to say that basically the source cited is the same as the previous source. It's usually only used in Chicago of the 3 that we've talked about, so you're not going to be using it in your in-text citations, but you might be reading it in some of the sources that you have in your research. So just so you know, that means the citation right before it is the same as the one cited as ibid. And I'll go over a little bit more with APA today, since that's the style most of you are working with. So the standard citation, you guys probably know a lot of this, is really clear: last name, comma, the year. 2 authors use an ampersand, that's the little and symbol in there, comma, the year. Very simple. And then, like we just talked about, et al., that'll be in the next slide, but that would indicate that there are 3 or more authors. For quotes, this is one of the most common errors I've had with students, is that quotes are not included with the page number. But for a quote in APA style, you always need to include the page number, unless it's an online source and does not have pages. Most of you are probably working with peer-reviewed journal articles, books, etc. that all have page numbers. So every time I see a quote, even if it's only a 2-word partial quote that you've integrated into a sentence, that citation needs to include the page number after the year, as shown here. And then in terms of punctuation, another very common error is that I always want to see the period after the citation, except after a block quote. So with a block quote, you're including a much longer quote, usually 4+ sentences. You're indenting it, and we'll go over this in the technical writing workshop, but it's indented so that it's sort of in the middle of the page and it's single spaced and it's not integrated into the text, into your own words. So at the end of that, you would include the citation without the period. And just a few beyond the basics tips. So if you have 3+ authors, like I said, you want ET space AL dot to show that it's abbreviated, comma, the year. So not for 2 authors, but for 3+, you can use et al. In your citation. If you have a sentence that has 2 or more citations, the way to include it is not to just include a ton of parentheses, but to include them all in one parenthesis separated by a semicolon. So you can see here's our first citation, semicolon, our next one. If we had more, you could just keep adding them with semicolons in between. Indirect citations. This is if you're citing something in a source that is referenced in the source that you are reading. That's kind of confusing, but let's say the paper you read cites an idea from a much earlier paper. Really, the best practice would be to go to that actual earlier paper and cite it directly. But if it's something very small, you can just say as cited in your source. And finally, if you have a quote from a source without a page number, you should at least make an attempt to help the reader find what you're talking about, find the quote. So you'll have the last name, the year, comma, instead of page number, you'll give some indication of what section it's in. So, maybe there's a section called Pacific Islanders, and then which paragraph in that section it is. Obviously, if there's no sections, then you are not able to do that. You could just reference the paragraph, but do the best you can to help guide the reader toward where that quote came from. Another thing is images. So we commonly, it's very easy to just Google search a diagram that you need and dump it into your paper, but this is not best practice. What we really need to be doing is either creating our own images or obtaining permission to use the image if it's licensed or copyrighted, or using a free place to get images such as flickr.com/Creative Commons has a lot of images that can be used, especially by academic institutions or people operating within them. Unsplash, unsplash.com is another site that has a lot of free stock photos. So if you're just looking for some photos, you can go there. But if you need to get permission, you should obtain their permission to use the image in your paper, especially if you think that there's a chance you'll be published, because then there is the potential for a lawsuit if you did not get permission. And you should state reprinted with permission. And you should also cite images. So this is an example from a source. Styles vary across APA, MLA, for example, but at least have something that says source or credit and then where the image came from in the label there. You can also have a caption. If you have a caption, then you might put the whole source and accreditation in parentheses to sort of set it aside. Finally, I just wanted to include a little excerpt of an APA paper with perfect citations so you can kind of see how often people are citing. And this is obviously not always the case. If you're writing about your own findings, you're not going to have very many citations. But in the literature review section, for example, or probably the introduction, there are going to be citations all over the place. So you can see this person is citing lots of different sources. They're using et al. When they have lots of authors. So just take a second to read this over. You can also see a page number is cited here, even though there's no quote. So what's going on there? For some, if it's a really specific idea, they include a page number. The author might include a page number to help the reader find where that came from, that idea came from. So it's always okay to include a page number in APA. It's just not required. And then this is just a sample works cited page in APA. So one thing I want you to really take note of is how the second and third lines of each entry are indented. This is the practice with APA, MLA, Chicago. That's just how it's done. I know it's backward from how we're used to indenting the first line of a paragraph, but always make sure you do that in your works cited page. And I won't go through the format for how all these entries should display. That you can find on that site, OWL English Purdue, or using Mendeley. But make sure that you always are checking each and every one to make sure that you have formatted it correctly. That is it for plagiarism and citations. Hopefully the material here for this module will help you avoid plagiarizing, whether accidentally